everybody. Thank you for joining us. We're having a whole afternoon of CDM here. I must apologise in advance because I've been carrying around this horribly deep voice that I have now developed. I don't normally sound like this for days, but I promise I'm not infectious for anyone who wants to come and talk to me afterwards. So we are going to talk, as I say, further about the CDM. My name is Georgina Jarratt. I am the head of FinTech and Digitalisation at ICMA, the International Capital Markets Association, not to be confused with capital markets in the guise of many banks, where that means multi-asset. For us, this is the debt capital markets industry, so we focus on bonds and repos. You'll have heard, those of you that were in earlier, from my colleague Tom, who is a consultant working in my team. So we're very happy to be here. We're going to talk to you a little bit now about the CDM and DLT. It's been touched on a little bit by David. I was going to ask him a question as to whether, for those of you that were in the previous presentation, it's probably not going to be as funny, so sorry, but whether it was right to call the bridesmaid large. I think he called the bridesmaid large or big or something, which is probably not the right language. Anyway, I'll let Tom introduce himself, but some of you may have seen him earlier. We've got some brochures outside on the CDM table if you want to come and find out a little bit more about us. But the International Capital Market Association is a trade body like ISDA, ISLA, etc. The three of us are happily engaged together on this project. Actually, the first time I think we've ever properly collaborated, which is probably disgraceful. But anyway, there we are. And we've been working together for a very long time. ISDA actually, obviously, has been working on the CDM a lot longer than us, and David gave you a little sense of that in the previous conversation. So we have around about 630 member firms. We represent the debt capital markets industry globally, and that's about 71 jurisdictions around the world, so fully global, and actually all different types of member firms, from the buy side, sell side, issuers, investors, asset managers, the data, technology, vendors, operational community, the market infrastructures, etc. They're all members of ours. And the advantage of that is that when we come to solve something, create something, build something, design something, whatever it may be, we get the voice of lots and lots of different groups of people. Now, the challenge with that kind of comes on to the CDM a little bit, and also our other model and standard, the bond data taxonomy that I'll touch on, is that herding those cats together to standardise something is really difficult. It takes years. And I think, you know, Tom said this morning, or somebody said this morning, that we've been working on some of these models for like 3 years, which sounds like a hell of a long time, but I think ISDA have been working on the CDM for a lot longer than that. Models and standards is a big part of what we do, but I'm also going to touch slightly more broadly on what we do in the world of fintech digitalisation. So my mandate, with my enormous team of 4 across that huge community that you see there, is to help with the automation and digitalisation of the industry, but to make sure that we do it safely and securely. So we have got to stay within the lines and the guardrails of regulation for obvious reasons, but I think the trade associations have gone from maybe people that the regulators didn't speak to now, actually, we want to do this, we'll just go via the TAs. They can ask their entire community, which is hard work, what they think about whatever it is they're about to do. And we can come back with a pretty informed response on these things. So this is just a little bit of, you know, what we do as an overall association. The majority of the team work on market practice and regulatory policy topics. So we cover the primary market, secondary market, repo and collateral, and then all of the operations and technology back office type activities. And then we have 2 cross-cutting themes. One is mine, fintech digitalisation, and the other one is sustainable finance. So we are the custodians, to overuse the word custodians, of what are now known as the principles. These are principles relating to sustainable finance for our market. I call ourselves the custodian because we didn't write them, we didn't come up with them, the banks and other big members of our association did, but we look after them and kind of govern how those principles are used. So that's just a little bit about the organisation as a whole. These are our priorities within my world. So articulating and monitoring the themes driving the automation and digitalisation of the industry. As I say, you know, it's the hottest topic. We are permanently being asked to run events on AI at the moment. In fact, so overwhelming is the demand on this, it's crazy. Our AI and capital markets working group went from 0 to about 300 in about a week. A lot of those people are what I would politely and respectfully refer to as meeting tourists. So they turn up to learn about AI, which is completely fine. A lot of what we do as a trade association is to educate And a lot of our members will come along and talk about what they're doing with AI, and it's just really helpful for for you all to learn from one another in the community. DLT we've been working on for a very long time, about 7 years. When I first took the role about 3 years ago, my boss, the CEO, said, "Is this ever going to happen?" And I was like, absolutely, of course it is going to happen. And actually, we have seen a lot of real activity now. The primary market in our world is extremely active. The secondary market isn't quite there. Those of you that are involved in the world of DLT will know that that's partly because we don't have the cash leg sorted. This is the whole CBDC debate, what's going to happen with stable coins, etc. And we're about to issue some really interesting information about that, which we'll touch on in a minute, from actually our work with the MAS, the Monetary Authority of Singapore, in Project Guardian, where we're looking at the DVP solutions and also custody around digital assets, because it's a world where there is a lot still to unpick. Intersection between sustainable finance and fintech and digitalization, interestingly, where actually AI tends to be the hot topic. That's where AI is very powerful. There's a lot of data to unpick in the world of sustainable finance. And also looking specifically at the innovation of the primary market in particular, which is very non-automated in our world. I always say that's because the primary market boys and girls, used to be only boys, all had very large tummies and did huge lunches over their deals because there weren't that many and they were massive. So there is an argument to say actually that the human element of that part of the industry will always need to remain, because it's not really something you would automate so much as, say, the repo world, where there are gallons and gallons of transactions. So the secondary market, much more innovative for us. We do a huge amount of regulatory engagement. As I've mentioned, we don't call this lobbying, we call it advocacy by design. There have been a massive number of different regulatory consultations around AI. We do them all over the world. There's a whole load of information on our website about this if you're interested in looking at that, and most of this is available to you whether you're a member of ours or not. So some of them are mentioned there, and I've talked about MAS, who have done a Guardian project around DLT, which we are now running from a fixed income perspective. And models and standards is what we're here talking to you guys about today. So it's a very important part of what we do, because if you want to automate and digitalize the industry, ideally you will all start from the same place, but obviously with an industry that's very fragmented and not starting from the same place, it's quite difficult. But the trick there is to build the models and standards and then hope that people start to pick them up and use them. And certainly with the CDM, we've seen that a lot. There's a whole load of deliverables around DLT, which we'll touch on in a minute, which again are fully available for anyone who's interested to look at them. So we have a working group around DLT bonds. This has been around for quite some long time. It's open to members of ICMA to join, but obviously if anyone here is interested, please do get in touch with me and we can have a conversation about that. In my world, we have to go beyond just the members of ICMA, because a lot of the people who are automating and digitalizing are not yet members of ICMA. They may become members at some point. So we try to be a little bit more open about these things. So providing market guidance, demystifying what we really mean by this, is a really simple document which in some jurisdictions around the world has been extremely useful with the regulators, just to go, what is a DLT bond? Sounds very simple, really isn't. You can use DLT in all sorts of different ways, as we all know, in different parts of that trade life cycle. So, it's not as straightforward as just saying it's a DLT bond. Dialogue with regulators we've touched on, and the participation, as I say, is mostly limited to member firms, because our membership covers the majority of the industry around the world. So this is just a little bit more information on Guardian. So as well as our own DLT bonds working group, we also chair the Guardian fixed income workstream. Now that gives us the benefit of more members in the Asia region who are working on the subject, being part of our community, but also as we are the Global Trade Association for Fixed Income, it makes absolute sense that we took over this workstream, which was originally run by UBS out in Asia. And there'll be a couple of deliverables at the Singapore FinTech Festival later in the year, if anyone's going to be there, that you will see coming out, particularly on these two topics I mentioned earlier about DVP and custody. So we do a lot of work. I mean, I think originally my CEO was like, right, we need a model and standard for DLT bonds. And I was like, yeah, the problem is, from which angle are we talking about technology? Are we talking about legal? Are we talking about regulatory? Are we talking about data? What are we talking about? And there's so many different angles from which we might come up with what you may call a standard. But I think the way to summarise this is that we are coming up with different elements of a framework which basically defines how this industry is operating. So if you're in this asset class and you're interested in and or already using DLT, then there's a lot of information on the website that you can get, as mentioned here. So MAS announced plans to support the commercialisation of asset tokenisation a couple of years ago, and we were part of that work stream from the beginning. There's also one on FX and a couple of others, but obviously we're involved in the fixed income side of that. I mentioned all the different materials that we've created, again, fully available on our website for those of you interested to read more. The reference guide is very, very detailed around everything to do with DLT bonds and repos, and consideration of risk factors and disclosure, so more in the legal and regulatory space, things to be considered. And again, what we do when we create this kind of collateral is we work with all of our members to come up with it. So it's not something that we generate within ICMA, the members of which in the second deliverable there, huge numbers of the world's biggest law firms, for example, contributing. So, you know, it enables us to get a pretty well-rounded piece of hopefully useful information that the market and the industry can use. The frequently asked questions were done very early on, but as I say, very useful, particularly when we're talking to central banks and regulators that really haven't looked at this technology or this the application of the technology to our industry. So recent activities relating to DLT, and Tom's going to come on and magically explain to you the links then between DLT and the CDM, but digital green bonds, which was great for us, was issued by the Hong Kong Monetary Authority back in 2024 on the 7th of February. The reason it was a triple whammy for us was that it was digital, it was green, so it used our green bond principles, and they used our bond data taxonomy, which is another model and standard. Again, there are some flyers on the table outside there, which really is a standardized version of the bond term sheet. So everybody using bond term sheets around the world, of course, uses completely different data attributes, and that is at the very, very beginning of the process flow. So if you start off with completely different data attributes at the beginning of the process flow, clearly, you know, trying to streamline or digitalize it as a whole global industry is nigh on impossible. So the bond data taxonomy has started to really, really be picked up by lots of different participants, particularly in the EU. Some of the central banks and regulators are now beginning to use it. But where somebody like the Hong Kong Monetary Authority come out, use it and talk about it, it's really helpful for us, because we don't ask the regulators to mandate the models, we just ask them to look at them and decide whether they might possibly like to use them in their issuances, which is exactly what happened. They're going to do another one. It's not publicly announced yet, but there is another one coming out, and they will use the bond data taxonomy again. Again, it's an automated, machine-readable data taxonomy, so it's very, very easy to pick up and use. Société Générale have created something called the CAST framework, so we've done a lot of work with them as to how that is integrated. And important to mention, on the bond data taxonomy, it's about to be implemented with ISO 20022, so it'll also go into all the messaging standards, so that's really helpful as well, because it just means there's one standard for messaging around this asset class. We've mentioned the fixed income framework, and HSBC put the BDT also into Orion. So that's separate from the CDM, but it's another model and standard that helps with the automation and digitalization of our industry. These are the latest regulatory developments. This is really around DLT. So in Europe, this was very recently on the 10th of October, the Eurosystem announced they selected members for the Pontes Market Contact Group. And HM Treasury have published a tender notice for the provision of services for HMT for the pilot of the digital gilt, which some of you will have heard about. And we've been advocating for CBDCs for some long time now. But in that document that I mentioned around DVP, it's a very useful comparison of the different types of digital settlement asset, CBDC, stablecoins, etc., and corporate and commercial coins issued by different banks, and the benefits and challenges with each. So I would really encourage you to read that. It's not going to be issued until the Singapore FinTech Festival, so early November. Obviously in the US, some of you based here will be more familiar with this. On the 30th of July, the Presidential Working Group published a report on strengthening the American leadership in digital finance technology, very much focused, I think, on stable coins, but from an ICMA perspective, that's something that we've just started to work on. What would be the global positioning on that particular asset class? Because it's very complex, as people who are involved in that world will understand. Terrible formatting, I don't know what's going on there. We had all sorts of spacing issues when we were doing this. I think it's when you copy from one PowerPoint presentation to another, so apologies about that. In Hong Kong, the SFC published a circular aimed at licensing virtual asset trading platform operators. So there's a lot going on around the world around DLT, and as I say, it's very much not in proof of concept and experimentation as it was last year when I was talking about this. We're actually in full operation. And on the 18th of September, 7 central banks mentioned here, I won't read them all out to you, got together with the Bank for International Settlements, the BIS, who we also do quite a lot of work with, publishing a report on wholesale CBDC. Now, nobody's actually moving, probably other than the Euro system, I think, on the wholesale Euro, which is obviously something that the Pontes Market Group is looking at. So a lot going on in terms of DLT around the world. So this is our view, in summary. It is going to dramatically change the issuance and trading of the capital markets industry, DLT, the technology. Interestingly, the head of the regulator in the UK, in a roundtable that he had with a whole load of different trade associations, very forcefully said the other day, we are not regulating different types of technology. We don't stop you using any technology that you wish to use. All you have to do is follow the rules. So if you want to use DLT, that's fine. If you want to use AI, that's fine. Just don't break the rules, which is probably the right approach, to be honest. So many of the service providers and central agents like registrars, custodians, etc., are beginning to improve their operations already by adopting DLT, as you will be aware. But there's a lot that we've still got to solve. So you'll hear of this topic of interoperability, which was a big topic at Cybos, where I was, I've lost the plot, maybe 2 weeks ago. And, you know, it's something that we've got to solve, but there's a lot of different elements of interoperability that we do need to solve. Data standards, this is why we need data standards. It's the best way to try and get interoperability to happen. And supporting life cycle events through models such as the CDM, which we'll talk about. And then obviously central bank currency or another alternative in order to give us cash on chain. So we're continuing to work with all of our industry participants on all these topics. As I say, we've been doing it for a very long time. If you want to learn more, please come and talk to us. You're very welcome to join the community, as I say, and we can have those conversations later. But I'm now, forgot about this, events, sorry. Another huge part of what we do is events. We tend to talk about all the topics that I've covered here. On the left are all the events that we've done already. These are external events. That one at the top was the one where the head of the FCA told us that he doesn't regulate different types of technology. So the red ones are external to us and the blue ones are our own events. Just to point out, actually the top one should now be on the left because it happened this week or last week. But we are running some of our own events later in the year. There's a big one in London for anyone who's going to be there. We're doing a couple out in Asia in the fringes of the Singapore FinTech Festival. We're also in Tokyo, where we actually have a sustainable finance event. But yeah, there's quite a lot going on in terms of events. So, you know, that's where you can come together and network with all the other people who are trying to solve the same problems. Tom, I hope I wasn't too long or too short. And my voice didn't give out, so that's good.
I'll tell you, great. I'll take that. And
there you go.
Great. Thanks, Georgina. Hello, everyone. My name is Tom Healey. I have been working with the ICMA for about 3 years now on the CDM project. I also, as Georgina mentioned, the bond data taxonomy. There's quite a bit of synergy between the two. One is for primary issuance, and of course, the CDM covers kind of all products. So I'm going to actually kind of touch on getting into a lot more kind of technology. So if you're interested a little bit more, I'm going to go actually through that and give you a demo. Really touch upon actually a number of concepts here of what you can do with the CDM. So it's not just high-level DLT, but I'll actually kind of show you a little bit of how you can integrate different interfaces into the CDM. So this actually kind of is not even just taking the off-the-shelf CDM, but actually modifying it for your own purposes. So Just to give you a quick introduction, if you haven't sat in a CDM presentation yet, the CDM is really a tool now for greater digitalization. It standardized the representation of financial products across participants for trading, clearing, and settlement across the entire industry. It implements an open source standard language and taxonomy that is constantly expanding with new products, new processes, new interfaces, and new services. It utilizes these model-driven workflows. So the workflows themselves are modeled, as you would sometimes use a UML or some other language to do the modeling. They are modeled in a custom language, or what we call a domain-specific language called Rune, but they actually generate executable workflows. They are very important in eliminating bilateral custom development. If you've been in the industry, especially as long as I have, you've worked with messaging interfaces, FIX, FPML, and so on. The specs are great, but then everybody goes away and has to code it themselves. No coding involved in this process. So this falls into this no-code bucket of what you hear about. Accelerates the transition to cloud services and to DLT environments, and it is developed and supported by 3 leading trade associations that really cover all capital markets. ISDA for the derivatives, ICMA for repo and bonds, primary issuance, and ISLA for securities lending. These 3 associations have been in it since the beginning. Are really the foundation of funding the entire process, but it's an open community that participates. So where does the CDM fit? When we started out, we had, first a vision, now we have a reality, right? The CDM really fits in the middle or in the center that integrates all the kind of different models you may have in your organization. So it integrates things from the client side, where clients' services or client interfaces are coming in, trading systems, integrates with trading systems into a standardized model. You may have lots of in-house applications. So it really is something that sits in the center to have a standardized now industry, cross-industry representation of financial products and services. It covers all products, all financial products, so all kind of base products, you'd say, bonds, equities, foreign exchange, commodities, financing products, derivatives, interest rate derivatives and credit derivatives, equity derivatives, foreign exchange. When I say that it covers these, those are pre-built into the model, but the way the model is structured is you can extend it for pretty much any type of product if you know what the cash flow structure of that product looks like. So this is just an example of what you would see in terms of a screen that shows the model of the CDM. This is an example, just a part of the tree from what a product is defined. I just wanted to show this because to give you an idea of those cash flow structures are built from the payout structures. So you can see here we have asset payout, commodity payouts, option payouts, performance payouts. You can build all types of products that are based on that cash flow. Sorry. And this is the workflow model. So as I said, it has not just a data model into it, but a actual event model. So you can chain your life cycle events together, and you have a lineage. These are all something that you can design into the model, and they all are connected through this entire event process. So underneath the CDM, it actually is a runtime engine that you actually execute that operates on the objects that you pass in. So just an example of kind of one way that we use the CDM. As I mentioned, you can generate, it has code generators underneath it. So here's, let's say, a representative of in this case, a digital asset representation. You may look at it in standard UML, but you would model this within the CDM and using the CDM language, which is Rune. It has all the structures you need to define things like classes and extensions and hierarchies and attributes, cardinality. All of that is built into it. It goes through code generators. So there's Java code generators, Python, C#, TypeScript, DAML. So there's a whole set of code generating libraries underneath it. You choose which profile, and then it will generate the actual code for you. And that way, everybody's using the same code. The same code came out of the same model, so everything executes the same way. Here, this is, we have, I'm technical on this, so if you take a look at it. Here on this side is the rune definition of what that object is. And then on the other side, if you were to run it through a Java generator, this is the class that you would get out of it, right? So why does the CDM really work well in DLT environments? Well, DLT environments are great for for transactions and holding values of assets. But what it's not particularly good for is when there are off-chain events and processes, off-chain data, off-chain processes, and so on. But in terms of the integrating the CDM with DLT, it has a lot of very parallel or similar capabilities, right? So one is the CDM is stateless. It produces immutable objects in the very same way that a blockchain would do that. It has predefined standardized event life cycles. Fits very well, as I'm going to demonstrate for you, with smart contracts. So you can do great smart contract interfaces. And tokens, of course, are not dependent on location or time and things like that, but the CDM has these standardized data structures. So you can have a standardized representation of the product, which actually is linked to a token. So just in terms of how you work with the CDM, so as I said, there isn't a lot of coding with the CDM. When you want to process events with the CDM, you use what's called an instruction. So the instruction is a set of actions that you want to take place, plus the attributes that you wanted, how you want it to take place. Those get translated into what are primitive events that are pre-built into the CDM. And then, as I'll show you with the extension, although it's not a standard part of the CDM, is you would go directly into a Web3 interface, right? So this would be, and I'll show you the model, you go directly into a Web3 interface. That interface connects to either your DLT environment, or through DLT you can connect to off-chain services, right? So that is the pass-through of non-code generated, purely instructions on how to execute events through the CDM. So here's an example of where we've created a custom Web3 interface. So we took the parameters that make up a Web3 interface, we converted those parameters into the Rune DSL language, and in the Rune DSL language, we then generate standardized code interface that's built into the CDM. So if you've worked with Web3, you kind of recognize some of these rather innocuous representations of attributes and things of that sort. So I have a whole set of resources that you can get access to, and there are open demos, open code. There's code in a repository that you can get. You can pull it down. You can actually work with it. And if you stop by, I can show you in a little more detail. But I'm going to run a demo now, if I get this thing here. And hopefully they tell me the sound is going to work.
Welcome to this demonstration of how to use the CDM to record repo transactions in a DLT environment. For this demo, we'll be combining two DLT implementation approaches, both tokenizing assets and recording transactions. There is no one standard, and various approaches have been used depending on the type of token, use case, and technology deployed. As an example, if native digital assets and cash were used, there's no need to tokenize collateral and cash on demand as we are doing in this demo. This example is technology and platform agnostic. We're not implementing roles, authorizations, or compliance rules. So this example could be implemented on a private or public ledger in a fully distributed environment. This demo is based on post-execution trade capture of a bilateral term repo. In this scenario, after the buyer and seller have agreed to the terms, the process begins by tokenizing collateral and tokenizing cash. The next step is to lock up collateral and cash off-chain and then process a transfer of digital assets between buyer and seller. The CDM is critical in this process as the source of the trade object and events. Because smart contracts do not generate these events on their own, they need external triggers to generate the events, such as asset transfers at settlement and maturity. In this example, we use 3 contracts based on the ERC 1400 standard: a repo contract, a collateral contract to tokenize collateral, and a cash contract to tokenize cash. Separate contracts are used to simulate interfaces to external off-chain services. In the first step, we will record the repo trade using the CDM. The CDM will generate its standard business event object in JSON format. We then generate a hash of the business event and call the repo contract. The next step is to tokenize collateral and cash. To tokenize the collateral, we call the collateral contract, create the token, and lock up the asset off-chain. To tokenize the cash, we call the cash contract, create the token, and lock up the cash off-chain. At settlement, we use the CDM to generate a transfer event that will call the collateral contract and the cash contract to transfer assets between buyer and seller. At maturity, we call the CDM again to generate a transfer event that will transfer the collateral back to the seller and transfer principal plus repo interest to the buyer. I will now demonstrate the process I was just describing. Here we have our repo demo application that uses the CDM for recording trades and performing various lifecycle events. On the screen are the details of a bilateral term repo trade. On the lower part of the screen are the action buttons to capture the trade and perform lifecycle events such as terminate, roll, re-rate, and so on. The application is built in Java using the CDM library and a Web3 Java API to interface into the blockchain. Here we have our desktop blockchain environment called Ganache, which is an Ethereum blockchain running on a private desktop environment. Transactions on the blockchain represent a record of the trade between the counterparties, tokenization of collateral and cash, and transfer of ownership from one party to another. We could have just as easily deployed the contract on a public Ethereum blockchain as well. And here we have our DLT blotter that records the events and interactions between the application and the blockchain. The blotter records the blockchain's transaction hash that's returned on each action. In this demo, I'll record a trade and perform transfers of cash and collateral. I'll start by booking a repo transaction. The trade is confirmed. The contract is formed. Here we can see the output of the CDM, which is the JSON object representing the trade. And here on the DLT blotter, we can see that the token was created and validated, and the contract was formed. You can also see on the blockchain a record of each transaction. We'll now call the purchase settlement event. The CDM will generate a transfer event. We can see here, this transfer event will call the blockchain to transfer collateral to the buyer and cash to the seller. We'll now call the repurchase event. This will again generate a transfer, this time of collateral back to the seller, and cash plus interest to the buyer. As you can see, the CDM is an important part of the process for recording transactions in a DLT environment by generating a consistent trade object and generating transfer events. Thank you very much.
So, usually covering this many concepts and demonstrating it all takes generally hours. Sorry, thank you. Usually demonstrating all these different concepts, and it takes generally a few hours to go through. So that was just a quick example, kind of touching upon really what the capabilities, full capabilities of the CDM are, and really just hitting on some of the points. Of course, DLT is what is so important today. So want to just thank everyone for coming. I'm around for another day. And if you want to stop by and learn a little bit more or get my contact information, reach out to me. Thank you very much.